It all started on a calm Saturday morning at Alpine Lake, a place where the water mirrored the towering pines and mountains in the distance, and the only sounds were the soft lapping of waves and the occasional call of a loon. Mark Ellison stood on the dock with a coffee in his hand, looking at the boat tied beside him. The Voyager wasn't just any boat, it was his late uncle's pride, restored carefully by Mark over years of hard work. To him, it wasn't just fiberglass and paint. It was family history floating on the water. He thought that morning would be like any other, peaceful, quiet, a reminder of why he chose to live far from the chaos of city life. But peace doesn't last long when there's an HOA involved. By mid-morning, the silence was broken by the sharp click of heels against wood. Delilah Brooks, the HOA president, strutted down the dock with a clipboard in one hand and a permanent scowl on her face. She wasn't alone. Behind her came a few neighbors, whispering to each other like a jury already convinced of guilt. Delilah was dressed in her usual power suit, today bright red, making her stand out like a warning flare against the blue-green backdrop of the lake. Mark noticed the smug expression on her face, and he knew immediately this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She jabbed her pen toward the boat and announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This eyesore is in violation. The HOA has received complaints that your boat causes unsightly ripples and disturbs the peace of the lake." Mark blinked, trying to process what he'd just heard. Ripples! On a lake! He almost laughed, but the way Delilah's eyes glinted told him she wasn't joking. The neighbors nodded like sheep, a couple of them crossing their arms in agreement. Mark set his coffee down slowly, his patience already wearing thin. "Ripples?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. "You're saying the water moving is a violation now?" Delilah didn't flinch. She pulled a notice from her clipboard and slapped it against his chest. "Effective immediately, this vessel must be moved. Failure to comply will result in fines." Mark didn't reach for the paper. He just stared at her, then at the boat. The absurdity of it all would have been funny if not for what happened next. Delilah uncapped a can of spray paint she had tucked in her bag and, without hesitation, scrawled big orange letters across the side of the Voyager, "Boat trash." The gasps from the neighbors were audible. Even they hadn't expected that. Mark's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists, but he didn't move. He didn't yell. He didn't give her the satisfaction. He just looked at the word dripping down the side of his uncle's boat, a lifetime of memories defaced in seconds, and he made himself a silent promise. This wasn't going to end here. By noon, things escalated further. Delilah called the police, claiming Mark was obstructing community use of the lake. When Officer Grant arrived, his cruiser lights flashing, the small crowd on the dock grew larger. Some were curious, others were hoping to see a showdown. Delilah pointed dramatically at the boat, at the graffiti she herself had put there, and demanded the officer enforce HOA rules. Officer Grant, professional as always, approached Mark first. "Sir, I've received a complaint that your boat is violating HOA ordinances. They say it's causing disturbances." Mark met the officer's eyes, steady and unwavering. "And what ordinance covers water ripples?" "You know this is ridiculous." Grant looked uncomfortable. He'd been here before, caught in the middle of Delilah's vendettas. But before he could speak, Delilah shoved her clipboard between them. "Here, officer. It's written right here. No unsightly or disruptive structures on community property." "This boat is disruptive." Mark finally took the notice, but instead of reading it, he walked to his boathouse and came back with a leather folder. He opened it carefully, revealing papers aged but well-preserved. Deeds, maps, contracts. He handed one to the officer. "Before you try to enforce anything, you should know something," Mark said. "This isn't community property. My family built this lake. My grandfather dammed it, my uncle managed it, and the rights to every drop of water here are still in our name. This dock, this boat, this lake, they belong to me. Not the HOA, the crowd murmured, uncertain. Delilah's face tightened, her confidence flickering for the first time. She tried to laugh it off, waving a dismissive hand. "Old paperwork. Outdated nonsense. This lake has been part of the community for decades." But Officer Grant studied the deed. It was legitimate, notarized, and clear. Alpine Lake was privately owned by the Ellison family. HOA rules didn't apply here. Mark didn't press the point further. Not yet. He wanted Delilah to keep digging her hole. So he let her rant, let her accuse, let her threaten. He even let her declare in front of everyone that she was issuing him a fine, and that failure to pay would result in legal action. Neighbors clutched their phones, recording snippets of the confrontation. Mark knew exactly what he was doing. Every word she said, every action she took was more rope tightening around her neck. He'd already installed security cameras on his property, capturing the moment she vandalized his boat. He'd already cataloged the ridiculous fines she tried to impose. And now, with the police and half the neighborhood as witnesses, he had all the evidence he needed. That night, Mark sat at his desk, replaying the footage from the dock. He paused on the frame where Delilah's spray can hissed, across the white hull of the Voyager. His Aunt Linda sat beside him, shaking her head sadly. "Your uncle would be furious if he saw this," she whispered. Mark leaned back, determination in his eyes. "He'll see justice instead. They wanted to fine me? I'll show them what real fines look like. Trespass, fraud, vandalism, every charge. I can throw, I will." But he wasn't going to rush it. He wanted Delilah to feel secure, to think she had the upper hand. He wanted her arrogance to blind her, because when the truth hit, it would hit harder than she ever imagined. Over the next week, the conflict grew like a storm cloud over the lake. Delilah sent more notices, more fines, each more outrageous than the last. One accused Mark of excessive dock presence. Another cited visual pollution. The neighbors divided, whispered about whether she was right or if she had finally gone too far. Meanwhile, Mark quietly prepared his case. He visited the county clerk's office, pulled every record related to Alpine Lake, and compiled a timeline of ownership stretching back nearly 80 years. He consulted with a lawyer, who nearly laughed out loud at the HOA's claims once he saw the documents. And he kept the recordings ready, each one a nail in the coffin of Delilah's crusade. But the breaking point came on a warm Thursday afternoon when Mark returned home to find a large sign staked in his yard. In bold letters, it read, "Community violation. Property to be seized if fines unpaid." That was it. That was the moment Mark knew it was time to act. He took the sign down calmly, carried it into his office, and set it beside the stack of evidence. Then he made the call. When Delilah received the notice days later, she nearly dropped her coffee. Mark Ellison wasn't being fined anymore, she was. The paperwork accused her of trespassing, vandalism, harassment, and fraud, all backed by video, documents, and eyewitness accounts. It wasn't just an HOA squabble anymore. It was a legal case, one that could strip her of more than her presidency. It could cost her everything. As word spread, neighbors who once followed her now began to step back. The whispers turned against her. People remembered her heavy-handed tactics, her endless rules, her obsession with control. And suddenly, the woman who stood so confidently on the dock in her red suit didn't look so powerful anymore. But for Mark, this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about protecting his family's legacy and ensuring no one could bully him on. The very land his ancestors built. The lake shimmered in the afternoon sun, calm and unbothered by the chaos on its shores. And as Mark stood there, watching the ripples stretch out across the water, he knew this battle was far from over. The real storm was just beginning, because Delilah wasn't going down quietly, and Mark was ready for whatever she tried next. Delilah Brooks had always been a fighter, but this time the odds weren't in her favor. The notice she received from Mark's attorney sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a full-blown lawsuit with charges that could stick. Trespassing, vandalism, fraud. Words she used to throw around carelessly at board meetings were now written under her own name, stamped with the county court's seal. Still, Delilah wasn't one to admit defeat. She doubled down, summoning an emergency HOA meeting in the clubhouse. The room was packed with residents, some loyal to her, others curious to see how far this mess would go. Standing at the podium in her fiery red suit, she slammed her fist against the lectern and declared, "This is an attack, not just on me, but on all of us. If we allow one man to stand above the rules, the entire fabric of our community unravels." Her words echoed, but the response was lukewarm. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They'd seen the graffiti she sprayed on Mark's boat. They'd watched the police officer hold up the deed that proved Mark's ownership of the lake, and some had even received copies of the lawsuit Mark filed. For the first time, Delilah's authority looked fragile. Meanwhile, Mark stayed quiet. He didn't attend the meeting. Instead, he was on the dock with his Aunt Linda, tightening ropes on the Voyager and watching the sunset paint the lake gold. He didn't need to hear Delilah's theatrics. He knew the evidence would speak louder than any of her speeches. But Delilah wasn't done yet. A few days later, Mark returned home to find yet another notice taped to his door. This one written in bold red ink. Final warning. Community repossession pending. She was trying to bluff, to scare him into backing down. What she didn't realize was that every false claim she made only strengthened his case. Mark carefully peeled the notice off the docker and slipped it into his growing folder of evidence. He didn't rage. He didn't panic. He just smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when you know the game is already won. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, when Delilah marched onto his dock again, this time with 2 HOA board members and a hired security guard. They stood in front of the boat like conquerors claiming new territory. Delilah raised her clipboard like a weapon. "This property is being seized under HOA authority," she announced. Mark stepped out of his cabin, holding not a weapon, but a simple manila envelope. He walked past them without a word, knelt by the dock post and screwed in a small sign. The words were simple. Private property, no trespassing. Ownership, Ellison family estate. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The guard shifted on his feet. Delilah's face flushed red. "This means nothing," she snapped. "The community owns this lake." Mark finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "No, the Ellison family owns this lake. And as of today, every step you take on this dock is another count of trespassing. Every fine you've issued, every threat you've made, is documented and already in the hands of the court. You want to keep going? Be my guest. But just know, you're not up against me anymore. You're up against the law." For a moment there was silence. The waves lapped against the dock, the only sound in the still air. Then, almost on cue, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up the dirt road. Officer Grant stepped out, this time with a county deputy at his side. They approached Delilah, not Mark. Papers were exchanged, words were spoken, and in full view of the neighbors gathering nearby, Delilah was served with official court summons. The color drained from her face. Her confidence evaporated. The woman who once strutted across the lakefront with all the power of a queen now stood trembling, clutching papers that spelled her downfall. News spread quickly. Within days, neighbors who once backed her began distancing themselves. Whispers of abuse of power and "she went too far" filled the community. Some even apologized to Mark, admitting they'd been too afraid to stand up to her before. But the real reckoning came in court. The courtroom was packed the morning of the hearing, locals curious to see how the drama would unfold. Mark sat with his lawyer, calm and steady, while Delilah fidgeted at the defendant's table, her usual fire replaced with nervous glances and whispered pleas to her attorney. The judge listened as Mark's lawyer laid out the case piece by piece. The vandalism caught on camera, the falsified fines, the trespassing on private property, the fraudulent threats of repossession. Each piece of evidence stacked, higher and higher until the weight of it all was undeniable. When the deed to the lake was presented, stamped and recorded with the county, the judge's brow furrowed. "Ms. Brooks," the judge said sternly, "you had no authority over this property. Your actions were not only inappropriate, they were unlawful." Delilah tried to protest, her voice shrill. "But the HOA rules—" The judge cut her off. "HOA rules do not override legal property ownership. Not only have you harassed this man, you've attempted to extort him under false pretenses. This court will not tolerate such abuse of authority." The gavel struck, echoing like thunder. The verdict was clear. Delilah was ordered to pay damages for vandalism, harassment, and legal fees. She was stripped of her position as HOA president. And perhaps most humiliating of all, she was fined for trespassing on the very lake she claimed to control. The neighbors erupted in murmurs. Some shook their heads, others smirked, a few even clapped quietly. Delilah sat frozen, her face pale, her reign of fear officially over. He leaned on the railing, watching the waves spread out across the surface. Those ripples, The very thing Delilah had tried to fine him for now felt symbolic. They weren't disturbances. They were proof of life, of movement, of resilience. And just like those ripples, the truth had spread, outward, unstoppable, until it touched everyone in its path. His Aunt Linda joined him on the dock, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Your uncle would be proud," she whispered. Mark nodded. "This lake has always been ours, and now everyone knows it." For the first time in weeks, the air around Alpine Lake felt light again. Neighbors began to fish off the docks. Children played along the shoreline. Laughter returned to the community. The tension that once hung over the water like a storm cloud had lifted. As for Delilah, her story didn't end with the gavel. Stripped of power, she became a shadow of her former self. Her once loyal followers avoided her, embarrassed by how far she'd gone. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood, but just another resident, bound by the same rules she once twisted to her advantage. Mark didn't seek revenge beyond the court's decision. He didn't need to. The lake was his, the legacy intact, the community restored. And he knew one thing for certain. No matter how loud or powerful an HOA president claimed to be, the truth was louder and justice was stronger. The Voyager glided smoothly across the lake that evening, the engine humming softly. Mark stood at the helm, the wind in his hair, the water parting before him. He thought about the battles he'd fought, the absurdity of being fined for ripples, the sting of seeing his boat defaced. But all of that had led to this moment. A man. His boat and the lake his family had built. Finally free from petty tyranny. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the water in streaks of orange and gold. Ripples spread across the surface, endless, uncontainable, and beautiful. And as Mark steered toward the horizon, he knew those ripples weren't just on the lake. They were in the community, too, reminders that no one, not even an HOA president, could silence the truth forever. Because in the end, the lake didn't belong to Delilah, or the HOA, or anyone who tried to control it. It belonged to the Ellisons. And with every wave that touched the shore, it whispered the same story: justice served, legacy preserved, and freedom reclaimed.